All right, we're talking today about zero tolerance laws. In the same folder that you found the link to this video, there's also a handout prepared by the Michigan School Justice Partnership that walks through the proposed changes to Michigan zero tolerance laws that we're going to be talking about today. I would strongly encourage you, if you haven't done it already, to download that, pull it up on your computer while you watch this video, or print yourself out a copy. It's going to make following along a lot easier. So let's start with a quick overview of what we're talking about today and why. In 2009, the ACLU released its report entitled Reclaiming Michigan's Throwaway Kids. The report concluded with pretty strong evidentiary support, and they looked at several schools in making this report that zero tolerance laws are discriminatory, particularly against African American students, and that the laws cause students to fall into cycles of increasingly harsh discipline that often result in them losing out on educational opportunities. Spurred by that report and its conclusions, the ACLU has teamed up with several like-minded groups since then to push for changes to Michigan school discipline laws, particularly, and these are the bills we're going to be talking about today, reducing mandatory penalties, requiring schools to consider exceptions or alternatives, creating a restorative justice focus in school discipline laws, and creating a body of data that schools can use to analyze their own approach to student discipline. Recently, the efforts by the ACLU have been combined with efforts by the judicial community, particularly DHS and the governor's office, and the combined effort is called the Michigan School Justice Partnership. So the politics of this and why we're talking about it today. The Michigan School Justice Partnership has the full backing of Governor Snyder and has been identified as one of his top educational priorities. Former Supreme Court Justice and current DHS Director Maura Corrigan, who is the head of the Department of Human Services, is stepping down at the end of 2014, and she is pushing to get these bills passed before she leaves the Department of Human Services. And while I don't think she's going to get it, I would certainly expect that we could see some action on these bills in the lame duck, and I would certainly expect them to come back next spring 2015 and be a focus of the governor in the upcoming legislative session, provided he wins re-election. So given that, and given that it's likely that these are going to continue to move, rather than looking at it as something that we necessarily need to kill, I think we need to start by looking at how these proposed policies would work for principals in their buildings and districts. And that's what I'd ask you to think about as we go through these today is how would they work for you? What are the trouble spots that you see? And are there things you can think of that would help work around those trouble spots, but still accomplish the same goals? And in the end, if there's something you simply cannot live with, we need to know what that is, because we're going to have a much easier time getting it out of these bills if we start focusing on that ahead of time rather than waiting until they've moved through the process. So let's get into the details of the bills and see what's in there. The first big focus, like I said, is expulsions. Particularly, the bills would remove mandatory expulsion for pretty much everything in the state. Per federal law, pupils with a firearm at school would still be required to be expelled, but even in those cases, the superintendent could modify the expulsion on a case-by-case basis. This is a big focus of what the ACLU wants to do, is remove mandatory penalties. It would also create a new requirement. Currently under law, school boards are allowed to consider 4 different factors before suspending or expelling a student for weapon possession. This would mandate that they must consider those 4 factors before suspending or expelling a student. Perhaps more importantly for you at the building level, there would be a whole host of new things that you would have to consider before suspending or expelling a student, regardless of the reason that the student's being suspended or expelled. The age of the student, the disciplinary history, you see the list. The thing to think about with these is not just, oh yeah, well, geez, maybe I consider these things already, but how do you document that you've considered these things? Because if you ever get challenged, you're going to have to show that you've documented it. Now, it doesn't have to be anything major, maybe just a checklist or a change to your school's discipline policy, but you want to be able to show that you've done this. And then, are there things on the list that are inappropriate, that simply shouldn't be considered? Clearly, this is the ACLU's list. They're going to want to negotiate from that. Three last things around expulsions. Currently, if a pupil is expelled from one public school in the state, the pupil is considered expelled from all of them. This would eliminate that provision in law. It would not require that you admit a student that's been expelled from another school. You could still deny admission to that pupil, but the pupil would no longer be considered expelled from all public schools. Right now, an expelled pupil or their parent or guardian has to request a petition form in order to petition the school for an appeal of their expulsion. Now the school board would be required to provide that form within 3 days after the expulsion, so they would no longer have to request it. And finally, you could not simply suspend or expel a pupil under these bills for truancy or chronic absenteeism. You would have to have some other reason to consider a suspension or expulsion of a student. Reporting requirements. Of course, there are reporting requirements. It seems every bill moving through these days has some form of reporting requirements. Remember that in coming up with these bills, the ACLU did a deep dive on school discipline data, and that's where they came up with their conclusion that these policies were discriminatory. They want schools to collect some of the same data that they analyzed so that schools can analyze their own data to look for not just discriminatory practices, but ways to reduce the number of discipline incidences. So as you look at this list, what can you collect easily? What do you collect already? What things on this list would require you to have a significant change to your data collection system in your school? And what could you not collect? What would be a giant pain in the butt to collect? These are the thoughts to have as you take a look at this list, because that's the direction we probably would go in a political negotiation on this reporting requirement piece. There are some new definitions. Expulsion is a new definition, anything removal from school for 60 or more days. Suspension would be defined as anything for fewer than 60 days. Finally, restorative justice, and this definition is important because of the other pieces that it ties into. Restorative justice, think of it as a focus on having the person who has caused harm, either by bullying or defaming school property or picket, be punished by repairing their harm. So they graffiti the school, you make them clean it up, maybe you have them do community service to beautify the school. If they've bullied someone, maybe you do victim offender conferences so that they can confront the results of their bullying and see what that's done to the person that they bullied. Restorative justice is a big focus of what the ACLU wants to see more of in school policies. And the last major requirement of these bills would be that you would have to incorporate restorative justice in your bullying policy as a corrective behavior at your school. The bills would also recommend, though not require, that restorative justice be the first consideration in remediating pretty much every kind of offense, like an interpersonal conflict, bullying, damage to property, etc. So, it's a lot of information in a short period of time, but remember, we think these bills are likely to go somewhere. So, as we're moving forward on this, do ask yourself, how would these policies work in your building or district? Where are the trouble spots, and what ways could we accomplish the same end, but without causing as many problems for you and your district or your region? And finally, what is simply just too much? What can't you live with, and why? And let us know that ahead of time so that we can do what we can to get those things out of the bills before they get too far down the road.